It's very nice to have you all here. It's even nicer to have the cognitive scientist, Professor Steven Pinker here, Johnston Family Professor at the Department of Psychology in Harvard, right?
That's right.
Good, got that right. And perhaps more importantly, Time decided that he was one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2004. I don't know how you're doing now. Does it fluctuate? I'm sure this will help, obviously. And probably one of the only cognitive scientists to appear on Desert Island Discs. So today I am the poor man's Kirsty Young. And this is very exciting for me, actually, because I did linguistics at university, and we worked out nearly 20 years ago. I went to see Stephen talk while I was studying that. I also lived in Quebec for a year, so we have some more connections that we haven't talked about. So I'm a Pinker groupie. And from the conversations we've had with many of the people in the room, it sounds like lots of you are too. So I'm going to start asking Stephen a few questions, and then when the urge takes you, we'd like to throw it over to you lot. There'll be a microphone coming around, so just for the purposes of the video, when you've got a question, if you wait till you've got the mic, that'd be fantastic. So, Stephen, you've obviously got this incredibly respected background as a scientist, and now you've veered into the territory of writing advice, which it seems like any old Tom, Dick, or Harry can do. Even I've written a book about it. So why did you decide to encroach onto our turf?
I come to the problem of writing from two directions. On the one hand, I am a writer, so I have to think about how to communicate effectively. I have to deal with copy editors who sometimes make my prose better and sometimes make it worse. And so I give a lot of thought to how to communicate effectively, particularly how to communicate sometimes fairly arcane, esoteric, technical material to a wide audience. On the other hand, language is also what I actually study. I don't study worms or birds or global warming or poetry of Elizabeth Bishop, but I study language. Very few people who actually study language try to translate it into guidelines on how to use language more effectively. And I thought that there was a need for a book that tried to do that. There are, as Neil mentioned, no shortage of style guides, usage manuals, but none of them are really informed by anything we've learned about language from linguistics, from cognitive science over the last 60 years. And we've learned a lot, so I thought it would be good to try to apply it.
And why do you think, you're completely right, that it's a sector, if you like, where people are allowed to comment on it with no background in it at all? Why do we accept that in the world of language in the way that, I remember reading someone saying, just because you can breathe doesn't mean you can comment on respiratory biology.
Yes, that's right.
But there are loads of journalists saying this is what you should do linguistically. So why do we tolerate that?
Yeah, I think part of the blame goes to the field of linguistics for not weighing in on areas in which the linguists themselves know something. So they've left this vacuum. People are legitimately concerned with how to communicate more effectively, and the linguists haven't tried to share what they do know. And then it's just one of those areas where we tolerate a lot of amateurism from writers who believe that because they're writers and because they're angry, that gives them all the expertise that they need. And so they will deplore this usage or that usage and not even bother looking things up, let alone in technical linguistics, but won't even look in the dictionary, because a lot of the peeves of the purists that, isn't it terrible that the kids today are misusing this or that word? And if you look it up, not only has that word often been a subject of debate for 100 years or more, it's not the kids today, but what gets on the nerves of the purist often was the original correct sense of the word. So just to give you an example, like disinterested. Many people use it to mean bored, and the sticklers would say it only means impartial, without a vested interest in. And this will often be accompanied by more and more people are misusing disinterested to mean bored. Well, not only were they using it that way 100 years ago, but if you actually trace the history of the word, you find that the original meaning was not impartial, it was bored. And that the so-called correct meaning actually was much later, and they've pretty much coexisted side by side. So that's just a fact about the language that you don't even need linguistics to verify. You just open the bloody dictionary. But the people who rant about usage don't even open the dictionary.
And why do you think people do rant about language?
Some of it is one-upmanship. If you are more of a stickler than anyone else, it gives you a claim to expertise. Part of it is that there is things that you grow up with and that you have refined become so second nature that the violations stick out like the, I'm going to use a cliche, even though you should not use cliches, like the proverbial sore thumb. It feels like an error, even whether or not it objectively is an error. But it's when there is some shared convention that then gets violated. Subjectively, it feels like a breaching of objective standards. And people don't take the next step and ask, well, who decides? I mean, is it like the rules of football where there is a international governing council and the rules are what they say the rules are? And that's just not true of English. But people act as if it is, because they don't ask the question, well, what does it actually mean for something to be correct or incorrect? And that's where linguists can weigh in, although they haven't, but they should.
And why do you think they haven't?
I think it's the pathology of academia, that it's a self-reinforcing culture where you study what your advisor studied and what your peers study. And since all of the evaluation is internal, the culture perpetuates itself. You ask the questions that everyone else is asking. And it's difficult in academia, as with any field, to step outside and say, well, really, what should we be doing? As opposed to, let's just busy ourselves with what we busied ourselves with when we were students.
Okay. So the book is a kind of outreach program.
It has absolutely an outreach program, yes.
Okay. And we've kind of got into an interesting area because in linguistics, there is sort of a debate between, well, not really in linguistics, but in the world there's a debate between descriptivism, kind of describing what the language is like and how it's used and how that might change, versus the sticklers that you're talking about who tend to be prescriptivists, saying, I think it should be like that. And I guess, sort of philosophically, you would describe yourself as a descriptivist.
Well, that's what linguists do, and psychologists interested in language. Like any scientist, if you're a scientist who studies plants, you're not there to critique plants or to make judgments about what's a better plant or a worse plant. It's just in the very nature of the enterprise that you try to characterize the world as it is. And so if you're a scientist who studies language, you're not in the business of passing judgment, you're in the business of figuring it out. So science is inherently descriptive. And then linguists posit these things called rules, which are a bit misnamed because they're not regulations. They're just whatever mental software allows you to speak your mother tongue. So if you say, the man crossed the street instead of the man the street crossed, you're following a rule of English. It's different in German. And that would be called a descriptive rule because it just describes the way you speak if you're an English speaker. Rules like don't split an infinitive, don't end a sentence with a preposition are prescriptive rules. They tell you how you ought to speak and write. There would not be prescriptive rules unless there was some difference between the way people actually speak and the way someone thinks they ought to speak. And that's what opens the possibility for prescriptive rules. Linguists tend to blow off prescriptive rules precisely because if you have to point them out, they're not part of everyone's intuitive feel for the language, and they're highly suspect. I actually think it's a false dichotomy because there is such a thing as bad writing. There is a difference between the version of the language that we use in writing in certain forums, like in government, in business, in broadcast media, which differentiate a particular form of the language from the spoken vernacular. And it's important to master that version of the language. On top of that special formal written dialect, there are also principles of good style. These aren't questions of what's technically right or wrong, but just what makes prose stuffy, turgid, bloated, unpleasant versus clear, sprightly, enjoyable. And there, too, you need prescriptions. I mean, that's why people hire your company. That's why people, I hope, will buy my book, because they really do want advice on how to write better. And that's a second kind of prescriptivism, neither of which is incompatible with what linguists do, which is, what does someone know when they know English or German or Swahili or any other language?
And when you talk about certain things being stuffy or bloated or unpleasant, is that just your opinion?
Well, there can be differences of opinion, but there are also very clear examples where everyone agrees that this is wretchedly written. So there are gray areas, and a lot of criticism consists of those. A critic will say, oh, this is badly written, and then another critic of the same book will say, oh, this is really well written. So reasonable people can disagree, but then there are just passages where it's just clear this is badly written, and no one would defend it. And a lot of academies is literally indefensible in that it's inconceivable that someone could point to that and say, yeah, that's well written.
So does that, you were talking about people getting angry before, does that make you angry?
I tend to get angrier with opaque, turgid, unnecessarily convoluted prose as opposed to violations of rules of usage. So even though I really think you should not confuse, militate and mitigate, that you should take care to make the subject and the verb agree,
People are starting writing this down.
You can do all those things and still be a horrible writer.
Yeah.
And what gets under my skin is writing that is incomprehensible or very difficult to understand, especially when it's avoidable, when another pass over the paragraph could have rearranged it to make it much more transparent. Because that is more preventable, and that's also more consequential, in the sense that if you misunderstand something, you could get into legal trouble. You could endanger yourself and the people that depend on you. You could be wasting your own time, and it can be prevented, because the author of bad prose is often just short-sighted and selfish. They put down ideas in the order in which they occur to them, not realizing that the order in which you can most easily understand ideas is not the same as the order in which the ideas occur to the writer. And so it's not an unwillingness to put yourself in the shoes of the reader or the user and say, well, how will they understand it coming to it cold?
And presumably saying what is easy for a reader to understand, that is something that you can do experiments about.
Absolutely. And there's the psychology of language, psycholinguistics, I think has made a contribution, although they too have not thought to apply it. There are literally hundreds of experiments literally, I mean literally, I'm not misusing literally hundreds, maybe thousands of experiments in the lab where people will respond to sentences as quickly as they can, and their time is measured to the thousandth of a second, or they'll be wearing a hairnet of electrodes, and the boggle response of the brain is recorded with in a wiggly trace. And so there is a science as to what makes sentences easy or hard to understand, and I think a lot of that can be applied, but unfortunately, again, because academics, like every professionals, live in a bubble, they haven't bothered to apply it, but should.
So speaking of bubbles, most of the people in this room work in business in some form or other. And I have a feeling that business is sort of understudied, if you like, in the world of psychology and of linguistics. Do you have any hunches about the language of business, or opinions even?
Yes, so business is kind of a target-rich area. And I actually withstood the temptation to make fun of business jargon, partly because that's been done so often. I mean, if you Google bad business jargon, or even business jargon, there'll be dozens of websites with lists of bits of jargon to avoid. Let's drill down to our core competencies and push the envelope, think outside the box, to develop metrics, to be on the bleeding edge. And
that was a laugh of, oh, I've written that.
Yes, right. But I didn't. Some of the criticism of business jargon consists of, people in black pots and glass houses who shouldn't cast the first stone. Academics and others are just as guilty. I wouldn't single out business. And I think there are some common threads as to what makes for bad business writing, bad corporate writing, bad legal writing, bad academic writing. So some of it is certainly the overuse of cliches. As they say, avoid cliches like the plague. And the reason being that if a phrase becomes too familiar, you stop processing the language as you should, namely by forming visual images, and which is the level at which you deeply understand something. Because language, we don't think in language, we think in much more concrete terms. And if you just ladle out one cliche after another, then you just shut down your visual brain, and it's just blah, 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 blah. And so cliche-laden language is ineffective. Another guideline is the what's sometimes called the curse of knowledge, the difficulty in imagining what it's like not to know something that you do know. To try to say, well, what would it be like if, for someone else who doesn't know what I know, who doesn't have my expertise, who's not familiar with the acronyms or the jargon or the abstract terminology. And so a lot of business terms, even if they're understandable to fellow business people, are not understandable to anyone else. And that's a common flaw in bad writing. A third is not being clear as to the purpose of writing in the first place, because there are actually two different goals that you can have in writing. One of them is to point to something out in the world that you've noticed and you know about, but your reader has not yet noticed, and you're calling their attention to it. And as soon as they see it, they will understand it. The other goal is to protect yourself against any possible accusation that you are not a sophisticated member of your clique. And so there's a lot of defensive writing that is not actually aimed at the person who's going to be reading it, but aimed at your peers to say, hey, I'm not a newbie, I'm not a tenderfoot, I'm not naive about, I'm not going to make any mistakes that will involve a sacrifice in my career prospects. And so people write for their peers defensively at the expense of the audience that they're trying to reach. And so I think that a lot of the think outside the box and the drilling down and so on is to signal to your fellow, to your colleagues, I'm one of you guys, I know what the priorities are in this company, so if something goes wrong, don't look at me, I'm part of the culture. And it's just writing for a different audience and with a different purpose.
So lots of people in this room then will have the job of stopping that second thing happening. How should they do it?
There has to be a corporate culture where you're not punished for avoiding the jargon. So you have to, and there has to be, I think, an explicit awareness of what the purpose of writing is. And this is, again, I avoided the temptation of making fun of businesses because I think academics is worse. My own, get your own house in order first. And also there is, I didn't want to indulge in a kind of a class warfare where journalists and academics tend to think that they're morally superior to people in business. And so a lot of the ridicule of business jargon consists of kind of moral superiority, which I did not want to indulge in. But academics, too, need to be reminded, ultimately, your goal is to share knowledge, not to impress your colleagues. Just being aware that these are two different things. And so you take the chance at maybe seeing, thinking outside the box, in order to do what everyone agrees you should be doing, namely reaching out to your intended audience. And academics and bureaucrats and lawyers and doctors, everyone needs to be reminded of that message.
So I'm interested that you didn't want to poke fun, because one of my favorite sections in the book is where you're talking about the writing of the author John Keegan.
Oh, yes. Well, a scholar, yeah.
Yeah, where he does quite a big demolition job of the writing of John Keegan, to the point where you said his book shouldn't be called The History of Warfare. It should be called History of a Man in My Field Who Gets Quoted a Lot About Warfare.
Well, so I picked up, my previous book was on violence, on history of violence, where I called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and I argued that contrary to popular impression, over the course of history, violence has declined. There's a lot less of it now than there used to be. And I have put in 100 graphs that kind of go like this for various kinds of violence to try to convince readers that as bad as it is now, it used to be a whole lot worse. So I had to educate myself on the history of warfare. And so what's the first book I pick up? A History of Warfare. And also, this is kind of, guy bait. Like, who wouldn't want to read about the history of, bloodshed and horses and armor and all that great guy stuff? And I read the book, and I was, on the first page, I was mystified. So first I thought, oh, well, I guess I'm, not smart enough to understand this. And I thought, hey, wait a second. I'm a Harvard professor. If I don't understand it, who the hell does? And as I kind of waded through it, and it's a bestseller, by the way. I mean, this is not some obscure academic tome. This was intended for a wide audience. I just found myself increasingly frustrated that it was so hard to figure out what the hell he was talking about. And I realized and when that happens, that is an opportunity for me as a psychologist who studies language to try to figure out, well, what's he doing wrong? And to turn my frustration as a reader into curiosity as a language scientist. And one of the things he did wrong was, you point out my kind of sarcastic retitling of his book. He indulged in professional narcissism. That is, instead of concentrating on his subject matter, namely warfare, he concentrated on the study of his subject matter, the people who study warfare, war scholars. And the first 10 pages were all about von Clausewitz, this Prussian military officer who wrote a classic on warfare. So instead of learning about war, we get page after page of von Clausewitz. And I guess it's nice that someone in the 19th century devoted so much thought to it. But and of course, if you're another scholar of war, you compare yourself to previous scholars of war. So I was obviously uppermost in his mind. He wanted to be the Clausewitz of the 20th century. But I don't care about your professional standing with regard to other similar scholars. I want to know how people killed each other in the past. Yeah. So there was the problem of confusing your subject matter with your professional guild, with your peer group. And that is, as we mentioned before, that's one of the contributors to bad writing in any field, including corporate writing. You confuse what you're doing with what's of interest to your peer group. The other was just overall organization. I have a chapter called Arcs of Coherence, which is very few style books talk about. That is above the word and sentence level, to talk about the level of the paragraph, the flow, the overall structure, the story arc. And that's where it fell short, partly because he knew so much. I mean, you almost never see his name without, you never see John Keegan. It's always the distinguished military historian, John Keegan. You might even think the distinguished is his first name. Now, that's a good thing. You know a lot. It can also be a bad thing. You know so much that you don't know where to begin. And the ideas just come tumbling, you're in your vast storehouse of erudition, the ideas just come tumbling out, and you don't know how to organize them for the benefit of someone who hasn't spent their life immersed in the study of war. And another sin in the book, which I try to lay out, is he didn't know where to begin. He knew so much about so many things that he threw in this, and he threw in that, and he threw in something else, and he forgot that no one knows about who the Hussars were, or who the Mamluks were, and so he didn't bother to explain it, or he did explain it, but like 13 pages later, so you spent 13 pages wondering who the hell these guys were. And so there's a difference between knowing a lot and being able to express it, and sometimes knowing a lot actually makes it harder to explain what you know.
So are you ready for the demolition job on this book?
It'll happen,
yes,
yeah. Yes, no doubt.
There's one other thing I want to ask you before we get some questions from the floor, which is, throughout the book you talk about the psychological basis of lots of the stuff that you're talking about, but also you seem to hint that lots of good writers do it instinctively.
Yeah.
So, lots of people in this room will be involved in training other people to write better. Is there any point?
Well, I hope so. As with anything, there are probably individual differences in innate talent or in interest. And I don't think you can pick a random person off the street and make them a great writer. But for anyone who does have to write for a living, I like to think you can make them a better writer. And I do say in the first page of the first chapter, a humbling experience came to me when I asked a number of talented writers I know, well, which style manuals did you read when you were learning your craft? And the most common answer was none. But that itself, I had to ponder that, even though I do believe that people differ probably genetically in how fluent they are with language. No one comes out of the womb writing in good English. There has to be a huge acquired component. And where does that come from if it doesn't come from style manuals? And how do I share that secret ingredient to becoming a good writer that is neither inborn nor comes from style manuals? And so I had to think about that. And the answer is they read a lot. And although good writers don't necessarily consult style manuals, good writers are almost invariably, maybe invariably, avid readers. And you can't master English unless you pay attention to what you read. For one thing, there's a lot about English that does not follow rules, that is just irregular and arbitrary and illogical. And if you try to reason it out, you will make embarrassing errors. So, for example, there's no reason that the verb to lose should be spelled L-O-S-E as opposed to L-O-O-S-E. And a common error that for people who are careful about writing always pops out of the page is people who misspell lose as L-O-O-S-E. Now, those people are not being illogical, because after all, the regular rules of English pronunciation would say that L-O-S-E should be lows, like hose, and if you wanted to spell lose, it should be like choose, with two O's. And there are many, many examples. Punctuation, why should it's as a possessive, like it's home, not have an apostrophe? If it's Pat's home, it has an apostrophe, but it just is. How do you learn that? Well, you could memorize a lot of rules. I don't remember ever memorizing that rule. It's just that I read so much, and you see it enough times, that it becomes second nature. Now, this might seem like totally banal and obvious, like, well, of course, where else are you going to learn how to write? But a lot of writing instruction, at least in the United States, in high schools, consists of telling students to write memoirs, reflections, personal diaries, and the emphasis is all on self-expression. Whereas the emphasis should really be on reading a lot and paying attention to details of the printed page. So part of it is that just that low-level stuff, spelling, punctuation, other forms of irregularity. But some of it is also what makes a good writer good is they often have a judicious choice of vocabulary, a surprising word. Instead of saying sexy, they'll say voluptuous. Instead of saying emotional, they'll say haunting. They'll just use slightly uncommon words that are a better fit and more pleasing. And that vocabulary, too, is something that you don't get by reading a dictionary from the first page to the last page. You get it from reading a lot of prose. And idioms. When would an expression, again, you can shade over into cliche, but we probably know as many idioms as we know words. They're like tools in a big toolbox, and by reading, you accumulate that toolbox.
I'm interested in that thing about surprising words, because I guess some research would say that's making it hard work for your reader.
Yeah, so one of my disappointments as a professional psycholinguist in applying the laboratory findings to writing is, and part of my puzzlement is why do we language scientists not go out into the world and apply our findings more, is that a lot of the laboratory research just looks at pure ease of comprehension. What gets you through the sentence as quickly as possible? And so your brain doesn't leap and produce these big waves that you can record on your electrodes. And most of it is just using completely predictable words. So if you say he ate some bread and butter, a psycholinguist would say that's a great sentence because every single word you process it in 100 milliseconds and you can barely detect any brain wiggles. But of course that makes for really boring writing. And it's often the surprising word that says, oh, that's a really good writer. So there is some dimension of understanding that scientists are tapping in the lab because they restrict themselves to the most prosaic prose.
Great. Let's go to you lot. Anyone bursting to ask a question?
So we're sitting here listening to this in English, and you've talked about how sort of meaning goes through waves and evolves back, etc., etc. But if you look at the fact, particularly in the business context, but also culturally, the development of English is now being more influenced by people who don't have English as its mother tongue. What do you think are some of the implications of that for the future of how English will evolve?
Yes, we don't really know because it's been such a recent development that there are Englishes, there's Indian English and Singapore English and so on. I suspect I don't think there have been a huge number of influences on standard English of the other Englishes so far. I can't think of, in fact, any example where an idiom from, say, Indian English has percolated back and influenced British or American English.
And from social media?
Very little. I mean, other than there are certain terms from social media that have come into the mainstream, but there are terms from any specialty that then get adopted into the standard vocabulary. We have lots of idioms from sailing, we'll take a new tack, and horse racing to jockey for position, and jazz and drugs and baseball. So the idea that some field of specialized field contributes vocabulary to the language is not new and doesn't change the language more than anything that people do changes the language. The idea that social media is going to change English, I think, is nonsense. And people say it, journalists are obsessed with this idea, and there's just no evidence that it's true.
Yeah. Categorically, it's not changing.
It is not changing anymore. Well, language is always changing under the influence of everything that people do. So social media are going to change language in the same way that the baseball changed language or the automobile changed language. It'll contribute to the vast stock of vocabulary and idioms and metaphors. But the fallacy is that people will start to talk in the way that they tweet or text message. And I don't know why that idea is so widespread, given how obviously false it is. We have, all of us have many ways of speaking and writing depending on the format and the audience. So when we give a formal lecture, we don't use the same style as when we talk to our members of our family over the breakfast table. When we in the old days, when people composed telegrams and they had to pay by the word, they left out the prepositions in the articles because why pay for them when they're redundant in context? That didn't change the English language. We didn't lose the thes and the tos just because people left them out of their telegrams, because there was a style for telegrams and there's a style for speaking. And so there is going to be a style for thumb typing a text message, but that doesn't imply that people are going to speak that way. And that's the huge fallacy in all of the journalistic hand-wringing over what social media and other kinds of electronic media are going to do to the language.
So where does that hand-wringing come from then?
Journalism is a profession of words. So journalists tend to be very protective about language. It's sort of their sacred domain. Also, there's to be a pundit, you've got to have something to complain about. Typically, pundits are older, and when you're old, you always complain about what young people do. So there's certain, I think, lazy
And you're saying
habits.
this is scientifically proven?
This is scientifically proven. It actually is scientifically proven that people always think that things are getting worse as they get older, and that as you become, that your life priorities change as you get older, and that people do misattribute changes in themselves to changes in the world, called the illusion of the good old days. Because every generation always longs for the good old days. Now, things haven't been getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And if you think they have, then you're a victim of the illusion of the good old days, because if you measure things, things are getting better and better and better. We're living longer. We travel more. We actually have more leisure. Anything that you want to measure will show that life is getting better, but the perception is always that life is getting worse. This has to come from somewhere, and the illusion of the good old days is part of it. So when you get older, for example, you become a parent, you have children, so you're more concerned with safety and stability. People's language abilities continue to develop into their 30s, and so a teenager literally is not as good doesn't have as much of command of the language as a 30-year-old. you get into your 30s, you listen to teenagers, you don't think, oh, that's the way I spoke when I was a teenager. You think the teenagers are speaking worse than when I was than they did when I was a teenager, and so you just don't. You misattribute the source of the difference in your own perception.
Mm-hmm. And are there moments when you suffer from it?
Oh, absolutely. I must, at least. And even if I didn't experience, even if my gut feeling would say no, as a psychologist, I know, I'm not different from anyone else, so it must be true.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Who else got a question?
Stephen, I want to ask, is there a point we're getting to where science might be inhibiting the evolution of language? So the example I give is politicians' speeches that are now poured over in the drafting so much that you have to see it is the word hope in it more than 8 times. Yeah. And I wonder, in the 21st century, would the Gettysburg Address ever get written?
Yes.
Or would Lincoln be told, put hope in 3 more times?
Yes. And, gee, 77, isn't that a very wordy? Shouldn't you just say, I mean, would it kill you to say 87 years? It is true that, I don't know of anyone who's studied this. This is just my own intuition, that it's true that if you look at the prose of 150, 200 years ago, there is a kind of vividness and poetry to it that does often tend to seem to be less common in the rhetoric of today. Partly there was a reaction in around the turn of the last century, in the beginning of the 20th century, against flowery, ornate language. And a lot of the style guides that are still in use, like the iconic Elements of Style by Strunk and White, like Fowler, Modern English Usage, there's a huge amount of inveighing against ornament, unusual words, vivid metaphors, and there was an attempt to make speech more utilitarian. There's the famous book Plain Words by Ernest Gowers, hired by the British government to try to improve the language of government in the early 50s. Also, because there's been you're right in part in pointing to science in giving us a vocabulary that can make prose more lifeless, even as it makes it more precise. So, for example, we now have the word aggression to talk about violence inflicted by one member of a species on another. Maybe a couple hundred years ago, when the word aggression wasn't very common, a writer would talk about the serpent, spirit of the serpent embedded in the bosom, or something like that, to talk about our innate aggressive tendencies, which is much more vivid and concrete. And some of the lifelessness of prose might come because we have this technical vocabulary. Now, I don't think we'd want to go back to some of the ornate, flowery, convoluted language of the 18th and 19th centuries. I mean, there are trade-offs. We have the ability to be more concise, more direct, more vigorous. But I think I agree that we have lost some of the imagery and poetry of language, and there's got to be some judicious combination of the two goals of being clear, concise, direct, but also vivid and engaging.
Great. So there was another question over there somewhere, yeah.
The writing as in social media itself, hasn't really affected the way it's written. Do you think that it will affect the way that writing is consumed, in the terms that people will be almost indoctrinated to consume at a much faster rate and only stick with it if it's small, bite-sized pieces of content?
I think that would be true if people read nothing but tweets, but I don't think that people read nothing but tweets. I mean, a lot of tweets have links to articles or blog posts. So no, I don't think tweets are any different from the journalists' taglines, or I think the jargon is DEK, D-E-K, the little cutesy title explaining the article below the main title, where you do try to sum it up, and those are typically less than 140 characters. So the medium of the pithy statement that sums up a complex issue in a few words has long been a part of journalistic language, and that's likewise in advertising, slogans, corporate slogans. There's always been a need to compress something to a very small number of words. only if that were the only form of language that you consume would it change the overall expectation of comprehension. So if people stopped reading anything longer than a tweet, but the fact that they have tweets doesn't necessarily imply that they don't read anything else.
It seems like lots of the job of your research is to bust myths that are kind of abroad. What are your favourite linguistic myths to bust? You talk about Bubba Misers in your book, right?
Yes. That's
My Yiddish isn't very good. Am I pronouncing that properly?
pretty good.
Yeah.
Bubba Meise.
There you go.
Yeah.
Which is a...
Yiddish word for grandmother's tale. And I grew up hearing that with my father talking to my grandmother, who was born in Poland and never quite got the whole concept of modernity. And my father would say, "Ma, it's a Bubba Meise." Namely, this is something you brought with you from the old country, but wearing running shoes hurts your eyesight. My grandmother sincerely believed this. And so I said, "Ma, it's a Bubba Meise." There are a lot of Bubba Meises, that is superstitions, folklore when it comes to language. So there are a large number having to do with usage, such as that you should not end a sentence with a preposition, you shouldn't begin a sentence with and, you shouldn't split an infinitive, you should only use aggravate to mean worsen, never annoy. So a lot of specific ones. I think overall, if I were to try to pull out the common denominator, it would be that the English language has a board of arbiters that decides what's correct and what's incorrect, and therefore that it's possible for 99% of people to misuse a word or construction. Now that is, given the reality that correct English is what careful writers and readers use, that is a contradiction. It's an impossibility. And it goes with the misconception that those arbiters are the people who write dictionaries, and that dictionary writers decide what is correct English or not. And I know this to be a misconception because I actually work with a dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary. And when they brought me in, the first thing I asked the editor-in-chief was, "How do you guys decide what goes into a dictionary?" And they said, "Well, we pay attention to the way people use words." And indeed, that is the way. So dictionary writers don't have, there's not a council of elders that gets together once a month and say, "Well, what is the correct meaning of the word aggravate?"
Yes, we're not French.
Yeah, right. We're not French. Even the French aren't French. They don't follow the dictates of the academy. What they do is they read a lot. They accumulate a lot of examples. And if, in particular, in a sub-genre of English writing, it's not just, they don't just eavesdrop on people chatting around the water cooler. They look at kind of edited prose or careful prose in textbooks, in newspapers, in magazines, in manuals. So it's a subset of English. That's the subset that you care about when you consult a dictionary. And they look to see if a word is used in a particular way across a variety of contexts. If it's a jargon term that's only used within a very narrow clique of bicycle racing enthusiasts, and no one has ever heard the word, no one would ever think to look it up, then it won't make it into the dictionary. But if it's used outside those contexts, they'll look for the common thread, and then they'll distill that into a definition. And if people use the word in a way that, even if it's a way that the purists frown on, if enough people use it, it'll go into the dictionary. And you will often be surprised when you go to the dictionary, especially if you're trying to settle some bar bet on, no, you're wrong. It's just not the way, we can look it up in the dictionary. You look up the dictionary and say, oh, I guess you're right. And that's something I discovered early on. Like it always bugged me that people use the word orientate. Damn it, it's just orient. It's a back formation from orientation. I said, you could look it up. Look at the dictionary. Look at the dictionary, and there, orientate, it's there. Oh, well. Because people, in fact, even though it grates on my ear, but it doesn't grate on everyone's ear, and enough people have been using it for long enough that it makes it into the dictionary, and there's no other arbiter.
Yeah. So again, because you talk lots about that in the book, and then there's a whole section where you talk about the things where you have peeves.
Yeah.
He likes data to be a plural and not a singular.
Now that I admit is a personal idiosyncrasy. So I would not. So for example, I like the data are, and that's an interesting datum. But my fellow scientists will say the data is, and then when they refer to the singular, they'll often say a piece of data, sometimes a data point. Now there, and I admit it, and I lay it out, this is my idiosyncrasy, so I would not criticize anyone who did what most people do. But there are cases where, so when I allow myself to be a prescriptivist and say you really shouldn't use it this way, I try to provide reasons. And one of the reasons is simply, trust me, the vast majority of your literate readers will have the same reaction that I do. If you use quotation marks for emphasis, as in those signs that say, we value, quote, cleanliness, or, fresh seafood, or I urge you to accept this student, she is a quick study. You shouldn't do that because, trust me, your readers will not react the way you want them to react. Or if you refer to your fellow graduates as your alma maters instead of alumni, trust me, that's an error. Why is it an error? It's because everyone will perceive it as an error. And that's why it's an error, but that does make it an error given your goals of reaching a certain readership. Or cases where you will broadcast to your audience, I don't think about what my words mean. And so the use of literally to me for emphasis, like I literally exploded. Now there's a sense in which there's nothing, that's been in English so long, it's not new. There's a sense in which it's simply literally is being used as an intensifier, as many adverbs tend to be used, brilliantly or incredibly. On the other hand, when you use it that way, you're saying to people, I don't think about my words, and generally you gain more trust if you use language in a precise enough way that your readers or listeners have reason to think, oh, I think about what my words mean. And so that's another source of advice where I really am willing to be bossy and say, don't do that.
So in that column where you give advice and you give your reasons, there's another one which I noted down where, again, it's a similar thought where the singular of criteria is criterion.
Yes.
And your reason you give for that is nails on a chalkboard.
Yes. Yes, that's right. Now, I think there are enough people, especially careful writers, who use one criterion, several criteria, one phenomenon, several phenomena, that if you say this is an interesting phenomena or this is an important criteria, a lot of your readers will say, there's a person who has not paid attention to what they've read in the past. Yeah. Now, that could change. And if there was a tipping point and people started to use criteria as the singular, then I would, I would withdraw that section. And that has happened in the history of the language. So, for example, agenda used to be the plural of agendum. So you couldn't have an agenda. It would be many agenda. And each item would be an agendum. Now, that horse has left the barn. Only the most obnoxious of pedants would say that you're making an error by using agenda in the singular. Or candelabra is another example. It used to be the singular was candelabrum, and so you'd say the candelabra are. But you just don't do that because we've forgotten that bit of Latin or Greek in the case of criterion. But that hasn't happened yet for criterion criteria. I'm willing to say, and I have data to support the idea, that most careful writers respect that distinction, and as long as they do, you're really better off if you do too.
Yeah, and when you were talking about those before, you said you used the word grating. It's grating on you, which is quite an emotional word to use. Psychologically, what's going on when we find that stuff grating?
Yes, it shows a lack of. Well, there's probably something that really is just visceral, namely that your brainwave shows a big spike when you. Now that isn't by itself isn't a reason to dislike something. It's just purely subjective. But what does it reflect? Why do you have that spike of brain activity? And why is it unpleasant? And why does it make you think less of the writer? And I think the reason it makes you think less is that you suspect that the writer has been careless in composing, and more damningly, careless in their history of reading. That is, they have not paid attention to what they've read, and if they haven't paid attention to the fact that the conventional singular of criteria is criterion, what else haven't they paid attention to? Have they just let the words kind of swim over them without actually parsing what they mean? And what does that say about how deeply they've thought about things if they don't really pay attention to the technical meaning of every word they've read? And I think that's why you're well advised to cultivate an ear for the way other careful writers use the language, because if you do use it in ways that will be perceived as sloppy, you might be betraying, fair or not, a history of inattention to detail in writing. That is, your obliviousness to form can easily be interpreted as an obliviousness to content. And you really don't want to do business with someone who hasn't looked at the details of a contract or a manual or a scientific exposition or whatever your expertise is supposed to be about.
And does it matter to you if that's not fair? If that person just hasn't read as much?
Yeah, well, ultimately, you really want to judge someone on what matters, that is, their level of technical understanding. And there are times when I do discount sloppy prose, when I know the person clearly does know what they're talking about. But there are only so many hours in the day. We can't do a detailed audit and due diligence on every person we come into contact with. We're forced to use a thin sample of behavior as an indicator as to something deeper. And the most available of those forms of evidence is if we know someone by their words, we use their words. And so that's why you're well advised to take care in what you write.
And we were talking before we started about getting letters from companies and how that feels. And I guess that's a similar thin sample. If you just get a letter, you judge the whole organization. Or you could.
That's right. Both its competence, its sincerity, and we're talking like when I write a complaint into a company and I get back a letter that says, at so-and-so corporation, we are dedicated to the utmost levels of quality and customer service. And I read it and I say, well, actually, no, you're not. And that's the reason I'm writing to you. So don't tell me you are. I know you're not. As a customer, that you're blowing off my concerns. And if you start off a response to my complaint with that kind of boilerplate, then I know that you really don't care about how you deal with your customers, that someone in the company thought, well, we really should boast about how great we are. But if you really were that great, I wouldn't be complaining to you in the first place.
It's nice to see a cognitive scientist get just as angry about that as the rest of us. We've got a question.
I'm sure we all related to your comments about bad writing when you mentioned Keegan, and it's a real block to continuing with the book. I read a book the other day, and I thought it was appallingly badly written, but I read it from start to finish, and all my friends agreed, yes, it's terribly badly written. I then got to thinking, maybe it wasn't badly written. Maybe it was okay. And that the book was written by Dan Brown.
Discuss.
Yes, and there is the Dan Brown phenomenon, where I have not read Dan Brown, but I know at least two other people whose opinions I respect a lot, who had the identical reaction to yours. After page, 457, it was, damn, badly written, but they couldn't put it down. So there, clearly you can, if writing has some other virtue, like telling a gripping tale where you care about the characters and what happens to them, and the author is good at manipulating suspense and curiosity, then they can draw you in, despite the obvious flaws in writing that Dan Brown does have. Actually, I had three people I respect, including my wife, Rebecca Goldstein, who is herself a novelist. And there she was in bed next to me. Damn, I can't believe how bad this is. This is atrocious. This is the 312th page of bad writing. Oh, 313, another page of wretched prose.
Yeah, it's weird. He's good at story. He's just bad at sentences.
Yes. And Clive James has a devastating analysis, but clearly he read it through to the end.
Any more questions?
Having spent quite a lot of my professional life trying to get rid of that bloated opaque prose in business that you talk about. My scientific take on it is, on some level, they're getting a kick out of it. Now, is there anything to back that up? Is there any endorphin release or addiction that comes from speaking a language that only a small amount of people can understand?
Yeah, so I think there is some positive motivation to speak in jargon to prove that you're a member of a clique, to affect a certain kind of pseudoscientific sophistication. Although I don't think that that's the main reason behind bad prose. I don't have scientific data behind this, but I just know enough of my scientific peers who I can say with a high degree of confidence they're totally secure in their station. They're not trying to impress. They're not using gobbledygook to hide some lack of knowledge. They're really experts in their field. They do have something to say. So there have to be other reasons. And I think among the reasons are the curse of knowledge, namely the people who use this language don't realize that it is opaque to other people because they can't put themselves in the shoes of a reader who has not undergone their autobiography of familiarity with that area. Also, as you become expert in a particular subject matter, you start to think about it more and more abstractly. Instead of thinking about, trapping mice, you think about, animal control measures or infiltration mitigation techniques, and you really think that way because you don't really care about the mousetraps. That's the business of the guy who lays out the mousetraps. You care about getting that guy there and selling something to your customers. And so you naturally think about things in abstract terms, but your readers who aren't in your line of work, they're still worrying about the mousetraps. And so likewise, another contributor to turgid writing is the use of what I call meta-concepts. These are concepts about concepts. Level, perspective, strategy, framework, context, issue. Now these, if you were to put your finger on what makes turgid prose turgid, it's often the overuse of meta-concepts. We have to approach this from a law enforcement perspective instead of we have to call the police. and people agree that we have to call the police is better writing than we have to approach this from a law enforcement perspective. So the approach and the perspective are really quite superfluous in conveying the message. But they're not just filler in that if you are an expert in a particular area, you really do think about different perspectives. You think about different contexts because maybe something you try over here doesn't work over there, and it's up to you to figure out why. So these meta-concepts are live actors in your daily problem solving. But for people who aren't in that line of work, they just want to know about the mousetrap or the police or whatever you're talking about. And so discarding all of the meta-concepts is kind of unlearning that you have to do when you communicate to someone who isn't in your narrow circle of professionals.
And in your own writing, do you have tricks to avoid the curse of knowledge? Are you consciously doing it, or is it just because you're a natural?
No, I consciously do it. Absolutely. I constantly ask myself, first of all, I ask myself, would a person who is not a cognitive psychologist, an academic, could I reasonably expect them to know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. But I also know that I have limited powers of mental telepathy in answering that question. And so I show what I've written to other people and get their feedback. I thought this would be obvious, but when people say, well, how do you manage to write clearly? And I say that I do that. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, you show it to other people. People do have to hear that. And often, it's important, the proverbial advice that academics say, oh, you show it to your mother. But it doesn't have to be your mother. Actually, it's kind of condescending towards mothers. But aside from that, even showing it to someone who's not you can be helpful in that each one of us fails to appreciate how opaque our prose can be to someone who's not us. Then also, failing that, even putting it aside and coming back to it after a certain amount of time, where you're a different person. You never step in the same river twice, and you're not the same person in a month than you are now. You can read it. I often look at it and I say, who wrote that crap? Oh, it was me. What did I mean? And even that can be better than, at the time, trying to get outside your own skin. But all of those are important.
We at The Writer, and probably lots of the people in this room, often have that job, I guess, of translating expert material for a more general audience, which is exactly what you've been doing your whole career. Quite often we get accused of dumbing down.
They're completely different. So I think that there is such a thing as dumbing down. That is failing to provide content that is necessary to genuinely understand something or to oversimplify it. But then there is bad writing, where the content can't get through even if it's there. And I think that it's a common mistake to think that if you express something clearly, that is dumbing it down. Now, granted, there is such a thing as dumbing down, but if you say, well, as Shakespeare, a famous English playwright, once said, or as London, a major, large city in England, that can happen. In general, because of the curse of knowledge, it's more likely that you will baffle your readers by assuming too much knowledge than condescend by assuming too little. And I think but I agree that it's often the fear of appearing to be, it's often the fear not so much of condescending, it's the fear of betraying that you yourself are a neophyte in having to explain something that should be common knowledge among your peers. You say, well, gee, if I explain that, then my peers will think, well, I'm so naive that I think it's something to be explained, whereas anyone in the know must already know that. If I'm explaining it, I'm kind of showing how innocent I am. That, I think, leads to a lot of bad writing. And in general, you're probably better off worrying about explaining too little than worrying about explaining too much. And I give an example in the book of an excerpt of an article by the theoretical physicist Brian Greene, who talks about very heady stuff like cosmic expansion, multiple universes, dark matter, and he explains it all in very clear language. And so he is, there's nothing highfalutin, there's no jargon, and he leads the reader step by step through why many cosmologists believe in the multiverse and string theory, and I would say without really dumbing it down, by the judicious use of apt analogies and everyday expressions, and I present that, even though it's not, no one would call it an example of great prose in the sense of stirring words or fancy language, but the ability to take a very abstruse concept and explain it without dumbing it down in plain English is itself a kind of literary accomplishment.
On this stuff about writing for the in audience rather than the wider audience, writing for your peers, I've so often been told, the people who need to understand it will understand it.
Yeah.
And I feel like saying, but why take the risk? But the reason for not taking the risk is it's actually hard work. It's difficult, and people are short of time. People don't have time to get back to it later in the day. People don't have time to ask their mums. How do you have any insights, any experiences on how you actually win that argument, and how that argument does get won in academia or elsewhere?
Win an argument about putting more time and attention into the quality of your prose? Yeah. So for one thing, it is generally when people say, well, the people who need to understand it will understand it, they're usually wrong. That is, even when you write for your peers, you are apt to overestimate what they know, even in very narrow circles. So I read articles in my own field. Sometimes there are certain journals in my field that are actually designed to convey findings to a fairly wide audience, at least within academia. That is, instead of being narrowcast to the specialists, it's so every psychologist can keep up onto what everyone else is doing in this general interest format. And even in those articles, where the whole idea is you're communicating, I often read, I don't know what they're talking about. Someone will write about the rabbit illusion and not explaining what it is. And I've been a psychologist for almost 40 years. I didn't know what the rapid illusion was, but someone wrote it on the assumption that I would, and I had to go to the web and Google it. And so the first part of the answer is you might be wrong in thinking that the people who need to understand it will understand it. They probably won't. Second, there is some degree of just kind of professional responsibility, almost selfishness, like who should be doing the work? Should you spend an extra half an hour and then save 1 hour among 1,000 people? Or should you spare yourself the half hour and force 1,000 people to spend more than half an hour deciphering it? And what are you trying to accomplish? If your goal is to get an idea across, why fail instead of succeed? And yeah, it will take you more time to succeed than fail, but don't you want to succeed instead of fail? If your goal is to communicate. So that's what I would say. And I think that people really do underestimate how much waste, toil, confusion, error they cause through unclear writing.
Or just people not being able to read it.
Yes, that's right, which is another kind of waste. But absolutely.
There's a question behind you. Maybe two questions behind you.
I am myself very interested in the essence of things, and Picasso did a drawing of a dachshund. It was only one line, but there is no doubt as to what it is. But that wouldn't have been what he did first. He would have tried to produce a dachshund as a photograph of a dachshund. Mm-hmm. So it is a very abstract and sophisticated goal we are aiming for, I suppose. So would you also, in that regard, agree that insecurity is very often camouflaged through pomposity when it comes to writing?
Yes, I think that can happen. Although I think a lot of pomposity and turgidity or turgor or bad prose is surprisingly easy to write. And it's surprisingly hard. That is, I don't think people are necessarily making an effort to sound pompous, overly technical. I think, as you hinted, often it's the simple, elegant language that takes an enormous amount of effort and work and sweat. I have a quote from that great philosopher of style, Dolly Parton, who once said, you wouldn't believe how much it costs to look this cheap. So you wouldn't believe how much hard work goes into simple prose, into paring down, as you mentioned with Picasso, omitting the needless words. That's the great bit of advice from Strunk and White's Elements of Style. On the other hand, it isn't always, there are different, as there are different styles in art, not everyone has to be a minimalist. And likewise in prose, it is not an imperative only to write in short, simple sentences and to use short Anglo-Saxon common words. Often that leads to dull prose as well. And there are writers who can be quite florid, Nabokov and Henry James and so on, and they get away with it. But it's different than your corporate hack who writes convoluted sentences full of, or academics. So it isn't just as simple as make it spare, austere, parsimonious. I think that in general, getting rid of needless clutter and ornamentation is good. On the other hand, if you have complicated sentences and you know what you're doing, you're making them complicated for a reason, rather than out of sheer laziness, that could be another style of effective prose. And I'm very careful in the sense of style not to force people to write in a particular formula, which some of the manuals do. Like, here's how you write a 5-paragraph essay. And in your first paragraph, you should do this. And in the last sentence of the first paragraph is where the topic statement goes. Or to say, as Churchill did, and as he, by the way, flouted, because he didn't only use good old short simple words. Often his sentences were, and a lot of their charm and beauty came from the fact that he would sometimes judiciously pick an unusual word at a focal point in a sentence. And writing would be so dull if everyone was austere or if everyone was flowery and ornate. It's really to know what you're doing, to pay attention to the quality of your prose as a separate goal from just barfing your thoughts onto the page. And sometimes thinking about how you express yourself will result in austere, elegant, parsimonious prose, and sometimes it'll be more ornate and flowery with lots of tricks and witticisms. But if you have an idea of what you're doing, then that is the crucial first step.
We've probably got time for a couple more questions from the corporate hacks, as I believe you just called them. Yes, sir.
You talked a lot about writing that's disappointed you. What writing has inspired you? I didn't catch your what book you chose on Desert Island Discs, but if you were going to recommend 2 or 3 pieces which would inspire us today, what would you recommend?
Oh, let's see. I think there's really a lot of good writing that's out there. So I don't think we're living in a time, despite the fact that there is an enormous amount of awful writing, and there always has been, but there's an enormous amount of good writing. Among science writers, for example, I think Richard Dawkins has an exemplary style. I think in philosophy, Dan Dennett is a wonderful writer. In criticism, Clive James is very enjoyable. Among fiction writers, Ian McEwan. My other half, Rebecca Goldstein, as a novelist. I feel not just compelled to say it, but I really believe it. Brian Greene as a physicist. Among people who have written about war and violence, I contrast John Keegan, who in some ways has a writerly flair at times for all his flaws, but I think that John Mueller is a superb stylist who also writes about the history of warfare. Yeah, I think there's a lot of good writing. It's almost hard for me to know where to start. I think there's a lot of good writing out there, despite all of the complaints about the decline of the language.
And you took the OED to the desert island, right?
Yes, I think I took, that's right, a dictionary. If it was the one book, yeah. I mean, that would be the kind of memory, because words just capture so much about a culture that if I wanted a reminder of the culture that I left behind, working through a dictionary would just be such a rich immersion in every conceivable aspect of a culture.
Where does your language thing come from? Why is it language that you're studying and not anything else?
Well, I do study other things. So for me, actually, I did start off, I'm not a trained linguist. I didn't have a degree in linguistics. I'm a psychologist. Mm-hmm. So I am interested in all aspects of the human mind. And I think, even though in many people's autobiographies, they, I think, edit the past so that their entire childhood inevitably leads up to what they did, I suspect, certainly for me, and I suspect in other people, there's just a lot of opportunism, that something happens and it catches your interest and you become good at it, and so you become better at it. And in my case, I knew I wanted to study psychology, and one of the things that opened up was research in a particular area of language, and one thing led to another. And it's not even the first thing I studied. My PhD thesis was on visual imagery, and I wrote my previous book was on homicide, rape, warfare, terrorism.
Which is our next event, by the way.
So for me, and maybe that does say something about how I come to language, namely, I always consider it as a part of human psychology. That's how I came to it.
Maybe one more question from the floor.
Early on, you mentioned, I think, sort of scientific studies about how clear people found writing, and you mentioned that, but that didn't really show us what was brilliant writing. Do you think there is, or ever will be, some way of getting scientific data on what people find great about the sort of the brilliant, inspiring side of language?
Yeah, I don't see why not, and I guess I'm enough of an advocate of scientific mindset to think that there's nothing that couldn't be studied scientifically. There are some studies of, especially as a psychologist, because psychology is the peculiar science that tries to take phenomena of everyday life and subjective perception and judgment and increasingly to make them more scientifically tractable. If only getting people to react to something and to put it on a 7-point scale or to break it down into a set of judgments and to count them up and to make the subjective increasingly objective, if only using a human being as your measuring instrument. And there have been some studies that actually try to quantify some of the differences between passages of writing that are independently judged to be a better quality versus poor quality, and to try to see what might correlate with that difference. And I don't see why that couldn't be done more in the future.
And I guess one final question from me. As a writer, what do you find hard? What is the thing when you go back and edit yourself that you're like, oh, I've done that again?
Yeah, I think coherence. That is not just like incomprehensibility, but coherence in the technical sense of putting your sentences in an orderly progression and your essay in an orderly progression, and even the first part of the sentence compared to the second part of the sentence, so that readers will have an orderly experience, an orderly unfolding of ideas. That's the part that, and the reason that I've never accepted an invitation to write a weekly column is that I don't have the gift, and I suspect most people don't. Some people do. They become columnists. Of just being able to sit there and just let the ideas come out of your fingers, and they read in a orderly, coherent way. I get the ideas on the page, and I do a lot of rearranging and interpolation. Like, oh no, I can't just throw that in out of the blue. People will not know what I'm talking about. I've got to set it up with this context sentence. Or, oh, I said this, these should be in a different order. So that re-architecting of the entire piece is what I have to work the hardest at. And when I'm dissatisfied with something that I've written, I thought, oh, geez, how could you just say that? That's a non sequitur. You have to set people up first.
Yeah. Great, thank you. We've all got a copy of the book. So on the tube away from here, you can give him a grade on his coherence. I'm sure you'll take feedback on Twitter or something. So that's it, folks. Do join us for a cup of tea or coffee. Professor Pinker is staying around, but I think we might whisk you off for some interviews here and there, so grab him while you can. There is a feedback form on your chair. If you've got time to fill that in before you disappear, that would be great. There is also a little postcard about the Writer's Style Guide app, which is available from today. We're very excited about it. And I guess doing a kind of similar job of debunking some myths and then endorsing some things that we do in writer style. I guess because we think no one else has really written the style guide for business in 2014. So have a look at that. I think that's all I've got to say. Other than that, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Steven Pinker.